Hey buddy, watch this.
Hello, Regis Kilbin is the name, and Hearthstone is the game, and this is part 2 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. I have 6 more cards up for review, including a couple with some interesting new mechanics to discuss. So here's how this is going to work. Like always, up first I'll be doing detailed reviews of each of these cards, where I discuss them for a few minutes at least. But if you don't have time, or you just want to see some new cards, of course you can skip to the end of the video, where I'll be doing quick reviews where I rate each card from 1 to 5 stars. There's a link to that spot in the video in the description below. Just click that and you can skip over me rambling on for the next 20 minutes. But if you do like to hear some detailed discussion about these cards, let's go ahead and jump right into my detailed reviews. Up first, I have the Carnivorous Cube, a new epic neutral minion at 5 mana with 4/6 in stats and 2 interesting effects. First off, you have the Battle Cry that destroys a friendly minion, and then a Death Rattle that allows you to summon 2 new copies of the minion that you just destroyed. So a little bit of downside early for a potential huge gain and upside in the future, trading some onboard current minion value for double that potential value in the future. So a card that allows you to potentially pull off some pretty crazy kinds of plays. I think, of course, the most basic idea for this is using it with things like Death Rattle minions, where you kill, say, a Devilsaur Egg, a minion that's just lingering around, not getting you much value anyway, and you turn that into 2 new Devilsaur Eggs, and maybe you have another Carnivorous Cube, and you continue the chain, or you have other ways to activate your eggs, etc., etc. I also think of things just like even a White Eyes or a Cairn Bloodhoof, like killing those minions, getting the value of their Death Rattle, and then creating 2 more versions, fresh new versions, that also have Death Rattles and other valuable effects, is pretty crazy if it all works well. And frankly, even if you don't have Death Rattle minions, just say you have that Boulder Fist Ogre out on the board, and you trade it into something. You trade it into a 5/5, and your Boulder Fist Ogre is now a 6/2. Well, guess what? You can kill your Boulder Fist Ogre, and then have this sort of Carnivorous Cube egg that's ready to be unleashed that turns into 2 new Boulder Fist Ogres. So you're fully healing the one Ogre, and then you're summoning an extra one as well. Even just that pure stat dump from Carnivorous Cube has a lot of value. So this Death Rattle becomes really, really powerful. It's just with a little bit of a downside at the beginning for some potential ridiculous combos. So sometimes it's just onboard stats, sometimes it's specific synergies you're trying to accomplish. Other times it might be actual combos where you kill like a Leroy Jenkins after using it, and then you later summon 2 new Leroy Jenkins. A lot of different things can happen, right? There's all kinds of interesting possibilities with this card. I haven't even thought of most of them, and my examples are probably terrible. But all that said, I think it's important that those opportunities exist, and when a card can do something unique and cool and ultimately potentially quite powerful, those are cards that tend to find decks and tend to find homes, and I think Carnivorous Cube is going to be a playable card. And the reason for that is because Carnivorous Cube has good stats. It's a 4/6 for 5. That is totally reasonable. You're not paying a penalty for the minion itself, where you typically do with something we've seen before, like Moat Lurker, for instance, which another kind of card where you could kill your own stuff and resummon it. Of course, that also had the potential to kill your opponent's stuff, so it was a little different, of course. But you paid a huge penalty in stats. That one felt bad sometimes to play if it wasn't doing exactly what you wanted, or if it got silenced, for instance. You just had a 3/3 for 6 mana, and that was awful. But if your Carnivorous Cube gets silenced, hey, it's still a 4/6. It's not that bad. Of course, you know, if you had to kill off a Tyrian Forge-Ring to get it, you might feel a little worse. But often you're using this on minions you know that you're going to get some value out of anyway, so you got the Ashbringer regardless. Even if this does get silenced and you don't get your 2 Tyrians back, you still got the Ashbringer in a 4/6, and hey, that's not terrible. So I think even though this card does obviously bear some risk and bear some downside, and it sacrifices tempo for future value and future tempo, that is still enough. Those risks still aren't enough to me to outweigh the potential upsides for this card. So in other words, I think the reward is worth the risk. So I do think this card will find a deck, and I do think you're going to see it. It's yet another pretty solid neutral epic, which we used to never see, but lately we see more and more of, so I wouldn't be surprised if Carnivorous Cube ends up being a surprisingly good card in the new set. So now let's move on to the Guild Recruiter, another new 5-mana neutral minion, this time a common one. It is only a 2/4, but its Battle Cry is also pretty interesting. utilizing the new word recruit, and in this case it recruits a minion that costs 4 or less. Now if you're still not familiar with recruit as a keyword, that essentially is a Yashiraj kind of effect where it just pulls a random minion out of your deck, and in this case it pulls a random minion that costs 4 or less mana. So is this card any good? And I think this is another one that actually has some potential to be played, specifically though in decks that are designed to utilize it. This is not the kind of card you just dump into any deck. It's not like a zoo kind of card or a mid-range kind of card that fits everybody, because if it summons a Firefly, you feel terrible. You spend 5 mana to get a total of 3/6 in stats, but of course, weak stats that are spread across multiple bodies and don't trade particularly well, that's not a strong Hearthstone play. It's not absolutely brokenly terrible, but it's not good, so you wouldn't run this card in those kinds of decks. But if you build your deck list in a specific kind of way, where you have very few low-cost minions, maybe just a handful of 1 or 2 drops, so that it's less likely to hit those, or in fact, if you have 0, 1, 2, or 3 drops, and you specifically want to hit some exact kind of 4-mana minion, suddenly Guild Recruiter looks a lot better. For instance, imagine you're running a Shaman deck that doesn't run any cheap minions. You rely on removal like Lightning Bolts and Lightning Storms and Jade Claws and Totems to play through the early game, and then you only have Flame Wreath Faceless as your 4-mana minions, so that when you play Guild Recruiter, you're guaranteed every time to get a Flame Wreath Faceless. Suddenly that means you get this nice little 2/4 body on top of the 4-mana minion. So essentially, you're paying 1 extra mana for a 2/4, which is really good for 1 mana, and of course you're also negating any downsides for that Flame Wreath Faceless. In other words, you're saving 2 mana in Overload as well. So those kind of scenarios are where Guild Recruiters start to make sense. You could also, for instance, run this in Warlocks, who typically have a lot of cards with major downsides. Lakari Fellhound in particular would be the perfect kind of card to combo with Guild Recruiter. You could also just throw in a Succubus, and in those cases, you're getting quite a pile of stats and a huge taunt minion with Lakari Fellhound every time off your Guild Recruiter. So it works. Now, downsides, of course, are sometimes you could draw those cards before you draw your Guild Recruiters, and then these become totally dead cards. That's obviously a pretty big risk. So I'm not sure this would ever be the kind of card you see every day on the ladder, but I think there could be decks from time to time that are able to make this one work and able to make it shine. There might even also be combo potentials with a card like this. Maybe you pull a Meat Wagon, which pulls whatever other thing, a Summoning Portal, or just maybe you try to pull a Summoning Portal. There's all kinds of shenanigans that are possible with cards that have really specific effects like these that allow you to construct decks to utilize them. So I have some hope and I have some faith for Guild Recruiter. Obviously not just an everyday card, not the 5-mana Cobalt Scalebane of the set by any means, but still a card that somebody will find a home for and you will see in a deck from time to time. Up next, we have a new Hunter spell, in fact, a secret. It's called Wandering Monster. 2 mana, as always, is the case with secrets, and this time around, whenever an enemy attacks your hero, now that can be an enemy minion or an enemy hero, it's just an enemy, you now summon a 3-cost minion as the new target. So this is following a theme we've seen before with secrets that cost 2 mana, which summon you minions that are worth 3. There's the Venom Strike Trap, the Bear Trap, etc. You get things that typically are otherwise a 3-mana minion, so it's sort of a 1-mana advantage over average, or sometimes even good cards in the case of the Venom Strike Trap. That can be pretty powerful to summon a poisonous minion like that unexpectedly. Wandering Monster follows that theme. Of course, the risk with Wandering Monster is it's a random 3-cost minion. So sometimes it could be absolute garbage. Other times it could be something you don't really want to see, or something that doesn't trade particularly well. And that is a pretty big downside. When you run Bear Trap or Venom Strike Trap, you know what you're getting. You're able to build it in a way, or play it in a way that's sensible and it plays around your opponent's strategy, and it's something that you can control. Wandering Monster doesn't allow you to do that. I mean, of course, sometimes it could high roll, right? You could get some surprisingly good 3-mana minion, but that's just as likely as getting something terrible. So, although it would average out into the long run to probably just give you something like a 3/3 on average, those inconsistencies and the unpredictabilities, to me, mean Wandering Monster is not the kind of card you really want to play in your deck. This is not going to be something that's terrible to get for free or to put into play for free off like Professor Putricide. That's fine. It's cool that it exists. It is disruptive to your opponent's plans, which is nice because even in an aggro deck, if a 1/1 hits a 3-drop, you're going to probably get a minion that sticks around, and that's some value. If a giant 8/8 attacks your face and you're trying to stay alive, you're going to disrupt the attack from an 8/8. If the opposing hero attacks, you're going to do some damage to them. So in all cases, you're basically getting some good value out of this. You're either getting a minion or some sort of disruption, which is nice. But again, the unpredictability, the uncontrollability, to me, just mean Wandering Monster, along with most other secrets as we've seen right now, just isn't worth being played on its own. Although, of course, if some huge secret deck that's very, very powerful finally makes the cut in the meta, then Wandering Monster would be a reasonable inclusion in that kind of deck. So now let's move on to what we're going to call the upgradable spells. There are a couple conditional spells essentially in the set. The first of which is the Lesser Sapphire Spellstone, a new shaman spell for 7 mana. And this starts out as a pretty terrible spell. It allows you to summon 1 copy of a friendly minion. Now, normally for 7 mana, that would not be particularly good. We've seen Molten Reflection do that much, much cheaper, of course. But there's a gimmick here. There's a new mechanic essentially being added that this spell can be upgraded. In fact, as soon as you overload 3 mana, so you could do it 1 mana, 1 mana, 1 mana, 3 mana all at once, whatever it might be. But as soon as you do that, you're going to upgrade this spell. And you can see here, the top right version is the first level of the upgrade into the Sapphire Spellstone instead of the Lesser Sapphire Spellstone. If you look at the artwork, it's kind of the mouth is like opened up to expose the stone there, and it's starting to glow a little more. And then finally, if you upload another, or excuse me, if you overload, blah, 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 another 3 mana, you'll turn it into the Greater Sapphire Spellstone, where it's all the way fully open, and it's really starting to glow and some electricity shooting out of it now. And in each of those cases, you go from 1 copy of a minion to 2 copies of a minion, and then finally to 3 copies of a minion. And if you start to compare that to a card like Molten Reflection from a minion per mana cost standpoint, you'll realize that 3 minions would cost 12 mana at the Molten Reflection cost allocation. But it's only 7 mana here, so by the time you get to that point, it starts to look like a more reasonable and efficient spell. But of course, just comparing one card to another doesn't automatically make it good or efficient or valuable. You kind of have to just consider the card in its own right. And even if you do fully upgrade the Greater Sapphire Spellstone, is it actually any good? And I'm just not sure that it is. Now, of course, the most obvious sort of combo, the one that was even teased in the reveal for this card, is with a card like Snow Fury Giant that also has overload synergies, so that you can play a Snow Fury Giant for 0 mana and then immediately follow it up with a Greater Sapphire Spellstone and have 4 8/8 minions in a single turn. And admittedly, that's pretty strong. That's quite powerful. The challenge, I guess, and the downside to that, of course, is that you do have to have an overload deck to make Snow Fury Giant work. We haven't seen that be super, super duper successful yet. There clearly could be a deck that comes out of the woodwork and does make Snow Fury Giant a very powerful card. So that's not a downside to the Greater Sapphire Spellstone necessarily. But the real risk to me is the fact that you just have to hold on to make that combo work. You're holding on to a dead Snow Fury Giant for multiple turns, and you're holding on to a totally dead 7 mana Sapphire Spellstone for multiple turns. So to get all these things together, it's just like all these cards are just in your deck, killing space, killing draws, and can a deck be consistent enough and stay alive long enough to finally assemble all of those different pieces? Maybe it can, but then even if it does, summoning 4 8/8s dies to Brawl, it dies to Twisting Nether, it's kind of gets negated by cards like Spreading Plague. It doesn't have Taunt, so sometimes your opponent could just ignore them and hit you in the face and kill you anyway. So it's as big of a swing turn as that could be without things like the Mage quest, which has also done the Summon 4 Giants, but they have the quest enabling them to attack immediately, or at least, after you hit the end turn button and get your extra turn, they get to attack basically in one swap of the turns. So it's kind of almost like they have charge. Without that enabling you to get an instant kill combo, would that even work? And I don't know that it would. So if that specific instance of this combo doesn't work, then when does Greater Sapphire Spellstone actually become good? Is it good to copy 3 minions of a 3-drop in a single turn? No, it's not that strong. If you have stuff that sticks around on board after multiple turns, like if you can stick a White Eyes or stick an Alakir or stick a Cairn, and you can summon 3 copies of those, that would be fantastic. But frankly, if you're in a position or in a deck or in a meta where you're already keeping a White Eyes and a Cairn on board for multiple turns, aren't you probably winning anyway? Maybe wouldn't Bone Mare just be stronger in every other instance than that one that you're already winning the game? So in other words, is this a win more card? Is this a combo card for a combo that's not that strong? I kind of think so. I'm having trouble envisioning exactly how this one works just because it is so costly. If it was like 5 or 6 mana, it would be a lot stronger because you could get it out faster. If the overload upgrade cost was reduced, that might also help. If it was, 2 mana instead of 3 each time to upgrade it, that could also make a big difference. So a part of me feels like the numbers on this one are just a little bit restricting and limiting in enabling it to do what it needs to do to become a really competitive card. I would love to be wrong because it'd be awesome to summon a bunch of giant stuff. That's a dream. That would be fantastic. That would be the kind of deck I'd like to play, right? But part of me thinks it just won't work in a high-tier deck. But it will certainly be a lot of fun, and I do like the design and the mechanic of upgradable spells. So this is one to keep an eye on, perhaps. It has potential. It has the raw power level to do cool things, but I think it's held back from a tempo standpoint so much that it'll never quite make the cut and never find a ton of success. Moving on to the next upgradable spell. This one actually belongs to Druid, and this is the Lesser Jasper Spellstone. And it starts out dealing 2 damage to a minion. And then if you upgrade this one by gaining 3 armor, it will turn into a Jasper Spellstone. And then finally, a Greater Jasper Spellstone, doing 4 and 6 damage each, respectively, as they are upgraded. So let's take a look at Lesser Jasper Spellstone, because I actually think this one is pretty solid. I think it's way more flexible, way faster, of course, than the previous card. A little less swingy, a little less high rolly, a little less fun. Arguably, this is more of just a standard-looking card. But, of course, being able to deal 2 damage for 1 mana, first off, isn't that bad. That's okay. A really cheap early game removal spell is the kind of thing we've seen find success before with a card like Arcane Blast and just even Frostbolts, right? Like Living Roots has done it before as a damage spell as well. Now, this doesn't have the flexibility of Living Roots, but the thing it does have is the potential to become better the longer it's in your hand, and that's really important because a lot of the times when you run those cards like Holy Smites or Arcane Blast in the past before it got moved to Wild, they were great at like killing a Knife Juggler or killing that early thing that your opponent played to keep you alive, but then as the game wore on, they become less and less valuable. Now, see, Holy Smite's really good in Raza Priest because guess what? It gains value again as a part of the combo. With Prophet Velen, it suddenly becomes a really important piece of just killing your opponent because it does 4 damage but also refreshes your hero power, so it becomes sort of a 6 damage card, and that's what makes Holy Smite so good in that deck, and that's why you can run it. It's flexible to use in the early game but also still holds power in the late game. And that's great when cheap cards can do that because they give you options and mana efficiency early but still raw power late, and Lesser Jasper Spellstone is another card that fits that mold. Because if you have to use it in a pinch, because you're just getting overwhelmed early, you kill that Flame Imp or whatever it is, use it as a Lesser Jasper Spellstone. But if it's not useful, if you're playing a control deck and you need to save it, just wait until it upgrades, and then use it as a 6 damage spell that kills a Raza or kills a Jade or whatever it might be. That's cool that it transforms and gets better and better as the course of the game wears on, because it still remains just as efficient, so you can sneak it out alongside other plays and use it as a pretty big tempo advantage in the mid to late game. So I really like that aspect of Jasper Spellstone, and that's to me why this card will probably find some play. Now, I don't know necessarily that Jade Druid or the Druids that we're seeing right now would run this card, because often Jade is just better focusing on ramp and just playing giant Jades. So this might not be a card that gets played right away in this meta, because we already have really refined looking Druid decks, but particularly with the standard format rotation, as Druid starts to find new ways to build itself and new kind of archetypes that come through in the newest sets, and maybe even in this set, depending on what cards come alongside it, I do think Lesser Jasper Spellstone is a card to look out for. So I don't think this one will see any play right away, but I do think it's a fundamentally good card, and it will eventually be something that Druid likes to run just because of that flexibility and that potential to upgrade. So keep an eye on this one too. And then finally I have one last card here. This is the Unidentified Elixir, a new 3-mana priest spell, and this is a targeted buff. By default, it always gives a minion +2/+2, but it's also unidentified. So when it hits your hand, this is what the card looks like in your collection, but when you draw it, when it finally comes up to be drawn, it gains a bonus effect. So it's +2/+2 and something else, and these are the 4 bonus effects that the card can be identified into. So it was identified, now you find out it's actually an Elixir of Hope. And it also gives the minion Death Rattle, return this minion to your hand. Or it's an Elixir of Life, and it also gives the minion Lifesteal. Or it's an Elixir of Purity that gives the minion Divine Shield. Or it's an Elixir of Shadows that also summons a 1/1 copy of the minion. So a lot of upside actually in each of these buffs. If you took each of these are pretty solid looking cards in their own right. Because a 2/2 buff for 3 mana isn't fantastic, but it's not bad. That's a good base value. But then each of these other things are pretty good. Divine Shield on a minion, hey, that's solid. That's a good buff. Lifesteal might be the least useful on average, but there are, of course, instances where that could be an absolute lifesaver. If you buff a big 5/5 that's already on board, you turn it into a 7/7, give it Lifesteal, that's a huge heal that your opponent wasn't expecting. Elixir of Hope, of course, is more of a value generator than an onboard piece. So that one's a little iffy, but if you hit the right kinds of minions that you will love to get back in hand, of course, Elixir of Hope could be amazing. And then Elixir of Shadows is kind of the sneakier, shenanigan-based one that could do some cool stuff. So I like Elixir of Shadows as well. Now, I think on average, each of these are good. They'd each be somewhat playable in their own right. Maybe not Elixir of Life as much as the others. I think these others would be a lot better. The question is the fact, is getting a random one any good? Because you're not going to be able to control or predict which one you get. It's just going to pop into your hand, and that's what it's going to be. And I still think that's most of the time going to be good, because here's the deal. You don't have to play it right away. You get to decide when to utilize this card and look for opportunities to use any given one of these options. Also, your opponent doesn't know what to play around. They don't know if you're going to have Divine Shield or Lifesteal or whatever it is. So it gains you a bit of a sneaky advantage over your opponent. They have to think about all these 4 different options if this is a card they know you're running and tends to be in the meta. So that's another nice little advantage of this card. And of course, the downside though is that you might be in a super value matchup where you need Death Rattle, return this minion to your hand, but instead you get Lifesteal and you don't care about health. You might otherwise be in a last-ditch effort to stay alive, and you don't get Lifesteal, and you get, a summon a 1/1 copy, which is useless for you. So it's just going to be tough to figure out exactly what kind of deck wants to use this, and how often it's going to be good. Now, I think the right place for this kind of card is in a Zoo-style deck with things like Shadow Ascendant, for instance. Imagine playing a Shadow Ascendant on 2 and an Elixir on that Shadow Ascendant on 3. In almost all cases, you're getting something, right? You're getting the 2/2 stats on a nice minion, which is, first off, pretty good. But Divine Shield on that's amazing. Summoning a 1/1 copy of a Shadow Ascendant is really amazing. The Death Rattle you might not be as excited about in a Zoo-style deck, but Priest doesn't have quite as many ways to refill their hand as a Zoo-style deck, so even that might be okay in the scheme of things. Again, Lifesteal is probably the weakest one on average, but most of the time you're going to hit pretty successfully there. And we've already seen some glimpses of Zoo-style Priest in the meta. There's been a couple decks that peeked into the top 50, top 10 legend from time to time, running more Zoo-oriented Priest lists. So I think that there's a home for Elixir, Unidentified Elixir, in those kinds of decks. Now, just we'll have to rely on whether or not the fact those decks are, in fact, part of the meta or successful for this card to be a hit, I think. But fundamentally speaking, this card has good stats for its cost, it's efficient, it does some cool things. So I think it is a good card that will eventually see some play. I like Identified Elixir surprisingly well. And there you go, guys. That was it for my detailed reviews of those 6 cards. I mean, really, a handful of cards I liked a fair bit there. I think enough of those are solid enough to see some play. I think those cards will show up. I don't think there were any absolute total duds in that set outside maybe the Hunter Secret looks like the weakest to me, but even that one has a slight hope, slight glimmer of potential. So what I'd like to do now, though, is run through each of these cards for my quick reviews, rating each of them from 1 to 5 stars. So let's jump right into that. I think Carnivorous Cube is a 3-star card. I think Guild Recruiter is a 3-star card. I think Wandering Monster is a 1-star card. I think Lesser Sapphire Spellstone is a 2-star card. I think Lesser Jasper Spellstone is a 3-star card. And I think Unidentified Elixir is also a 3-star card. And that's it, guys. That's part 2 of my Kobolds and Catacombs card review. I've been surprised so far that I think most of the cards on average are okay. I was a little harsh on some of the Knights of the Frozen Throne cards in the last set. A lot of them looked like duds. Some surprised me. A lot did end up being duds for the record. But so far, most of these don't look absolutely terrible to me. There are fewer 1- and 2-star cards in the set, even though I've already named a few. And there are more 3- and 4-star cards. I'm a little more hopeful for this set making an impact, which is nice. And nothing seems oppressive or problematic yet either. So it's going to be a while until we have more cards to review. But for now, I've got a pretty high hope for this set. And I can't wait to see the rest of the cards to see if reality lives up to my expectations. But guys, if you have any thoughts, comments, questions on these cards, of course, if you want to tell me why I'm wrong or why I'm right or why I'm stupid or why I'm smart, leave those thoughts in the comments below. But until then, everybody, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, game on.